Teacher humiliates poor boy, discovers his family's secret legacy. In a small town, there's a well-respected teacher named Mrs. Anderson. She's strict, highly organized, and expects nothing less than the best from her students. However, her dedication to excellence sometimes leads her to judge too quickly, especially when it comes to students from less privileged backgrounds. This is the story of Mrs. Anderson and her encounter with a quiet, humble boy named Danny, whose life she misjudges. Danny appears shy and withdrawn. His clothes are worn, his lunch is always simple, and he never speaks about his family. Mrs. Anderson sees him as another poor student who might struggle to keep up, unaware that Danny's family holds a powerful, life-changing secret that has impacted many lives in the town. When Mrs. Anderson eventually learns the truth, her entire perspective shifts, leading her to reflect deeply on her own biases and the impact of kindness and respect. As you read on, you'll see how a teacher's quick judgment leads to a heart-stopping revelation about Danny's hidden family legacy and the life-changing lesson that Anderson will never forget. Mrs. Anderson had been teaching at the town's elementary school for over 20 years. With her no-nonsense attitude and demand for respect, she was both feared and respected by her students. She believed in discipline and hard work, seeing education as the only path to success. One fall morning, she noticed Danny Williams, a new student, sitting quietly in her class. Danny wore an old faded sweater, his shoes had holes, and his backpack looked like it had been handed down several times. He always sat alone, rarely participating, and his lunch was usually a simple sandwich or an apple. To Mrs. Anderson, Danny's appearance seemed to confirm her assumptions. He must come from a struggling family, likely one that didn't place much importance on education. In her mind, students like Danny needed tough love to help them escape the cycle of poverty. She felt it was her duty to set him straight. One day, the class was given an assignment to present an essay titled, "My Biggest Dream." As each child took turns presenting, Mrs. Anderson listened with a critical ear. When Danny's turn came, he nervously approached the front of the class, clutching his crumpled paper. "My biggest dream," Danny read, his voice quiet but clear, "is to build a place where people in need can find food, shelter, and help. A place where families can come to find a new start." He spoke about wanting to give back to his community, inspired by what he had seen growing up. Mrs. Anderson tried to hold back a smirk. To her, this dream was unrealistic and naive. She interrupted, saying, "Danny, that's a nice idea, but maybe you should aim for something more practical. Running a place like that costs a lot of money and takes a lot of effort. Perhaps you should focus on goals that are more achievable." Danny's face turned red, and he returned to his seat amidst snickers from some classmates. The day continued, but Mrs. Anderson's comment left a sting that Danny couldn't shake. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Anderson's attitude toward Danny didn't improve. She often called on him during class to answer difficult questions, almost hoping he would make a mistake. Whenever Danny struggled, she would give him a disappointed look, reminding him to try harder if he wanted to succeed. One afternoon, Danny forgot to complete a math worksheet. Mrs. Anderson didn't hold back. "Danny, if you can't even remember your assignments, how do you expect to make anything of yourself?" she said, loud enough for the whole class to hear. Danny looked down, too ashamed to respond. Later that day, Danny stayed late to finish his assignment. Mrs. Anderson noticed him still at his desk, working quietly. She sighed and approached him. "Danny, life is tough," she began. "If you don't focus, you'll end up struggling your whole life. Hard work is the only way out." Danny only nodded, but her words seemed to hit him hard. When he finally left, Mrs. Anderson felt a sense of accomplishment. She believed she was doing him a favor, guiding him to face reality. Yet, around the school, she noticed other teachers speaking highly of Danny. His art teacher praised his creativity, and the principal mentioned that Danny came from a family with an amazing story. But Mrs. Anderson brushed these remarks aside, convinced they were mere sympathy for a poor boy who wouldn't succeed without a tough push. A few weeks later, the school held a community event honoring families who had contributed to the town's welfare. To Mrs. Anderson's surprise, Danny was seated at the front with the principal and several other prominent guests. The principal took the stage and began to speak. "Today, we are recognizing a family who has quietly supported our community for generations, the Williams family. For years, they have provided resources and shelter for those in need, and their contributions have touched countless lives. Mrs. Anderson's eyes widened as she connected the dots. The Williams family. That was Danny's last name. Could this mean, the principal continued, their shelter has been a safe haven for families going through hard times, and their commitment to our town is inspiring. Today, we are honored to have Danny Williams, a young man who embodies his family's legacy of kindness and compassion. Danny dreams of continuing this work, and we are so proud to have him here today. Mrs. Anderson's stomach twisted with regret. Danny's naive dream wasn't just a child's fantasy. It was a continuation of his family's real work, something deeply rooted in his upbringing. She had dismissed him, belittled his goals, and failed to see the remarkable person he was. After the event, Mrs. Anderson felt a mix of guilt and shame. She realized how wrong she had been to judge Danny by his appearance and background. Determined to make amends, she approached him the next day after class. "Danny," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I made some unfair assumptions about you, and I didn't give you the respect you deserve. I didn't know about your family's incredible work. You're an inspiration, and I'm so sorry I didn't see that sooner." Danny looked up, a bit surprised but appreciative. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson," he replied quietly. "I just want to help people, like my family does." From that day on, Mrs. Anderson's attitude shifted completely. She encouraged Danny, praised his dedication, and even introduced him to resources that could help him fulfill his dream. The students noticed her change in demeanor, and some even followed her lead, treating Danny with newfound respect. Mrs. Anderson's apology and change in behavior served as a powerful example of humility and growth. This story reminds us of the importance of empathy, respect, and the dangers of judging others too quickly. Mrs. Anderson's initial reaction to Danny was shaped by her assumptions about his background, but she failed to see the incredible legacy he was part of. By learning the truth, she was forced to confront her own biases and reconsider what it truly means to support and believe in her students. Danny's quiet strength and resilience are a testament to the power of compassion. Even though he faced judgment and ridicule, he never wavered in his dream to make a difference. His story shows that our backgrounds don't define our potential, and that sometimes the most unassuming people have the most to teach us. In the end, Mrs. Anderson's growth reminds us to approach others with kindness, understanding, and an open mind. The lesson here is simple but powerful. Treat everyone with respect, because you never know the hidden strength, story, or legacy someone carries.